Hello guys and welcome to week 3 of Psych Seminar. Here I have my handy dandy iPad again and I've just jotted down some notes, so let's get started. The area that this study covers is psychoanalysis. So Freud's work is usually difficult or impossible to test, and in this article we're going to look at a few studies done by outside researchers that apply to Freud's theories. So this study was done in 1996 and it's by 3 researchers whose last names go by Adams, Wright, and Lohr. This article highlights how id, superego, and ego come into play um, as defense mechanisms to manage anxiety and conflict. But right now we're looking or highlighting ego. These defense mechanisms are repression, regression, projection, reaction formation, and sublimation. So let's take a look at what each of these mechanisms actually mean. Repression is a defense mechanism in which an individual unconsciously blocks out distressing memories, thoughts, or emotions from their awareness. So basically, like if you have something that you don't really want to think about, you kind of just put it in the back of your mind. That is what repression is. Think about the word repress and what that means. Just think about repression, like you're putting it all the way down. Regression refers to a defense mechanism in which they revert to earlier, more childlike coping mechanisms or like safe mechanisms. The example that I got here was if a mother has 2 children, one is younger, the older child would revert back to the same things that the younger child are doing, or like crying for their binky, or wetting the bed if they're long past that. They're regressing back to things where they felt safest. Projection is one of my favorites. Is a defense mechanism where individuals attribute to their own unacceptable thoughts onto others. So, for example, let's say, I don't know, I have something about myself that I dislike and I'm like finding it in other people and I'm calling it out in other people. That is projection. I'm projecting my thoughts and my feelings about myself or anything else onto other people. Reaction formation is where a person replaces an unacceptable or threatening desire with the direct opposite action. Reaction formation is a defense mechanism where a person unconsciously replaces a unacceptable or threatening desire with the exact opposite action. So we're going to get into reaction formation a little bit more within the study. And please excuse me, I think my allergies are like flaring right now. Lastly, sublimation is a defense mechanism where unacceptable impulses or desires are channeled into socially acceptable behaviors or activities. So for example, if I'm feeling angry and like I want to punch someone, I would go, join a kickboxing class. Okay, and lastly, sublimation is a defense mechanism where unacceptable impulses or behaviors or emotions are channeled into socially accepted behaviors or activities. So for example, if I'm feeling angry and like I just want to punch something, I may go join a kickboxing class or a karate class or something to channel that aggression into things that are socially acceptable. In this study, we're going to take a look at homophobia and how it actually may be associated with one of those defenses coming in and protecting an individual from these thoughts that they view as harmful. And I told you guys we were going to talk about reaction formation in this study. I do think that this is a pretty good way to test out how the id, ego, and superego comes to play, since it is very hard to wager whether these parts of the personality are actually there or not, if that makes sense. So in this study, a group of men were giving a written test to determine their level of of homophobia, and then divided into two groups, homophobic and non-homophobic. They were then exposed to explicit heterosexual, gay, or lesbian sexual scenes. And while they viewed these scenes, they were monitored for signs of sexual arousal. The results read that 66% of the non-homophobic group showed little to no signs of arousal, but only 20% of the homophobic men showed little to no signs of arousal. So about 44% of the non-homophobic group was aroused, while 80% of the homophobic group was aroused. The pros and cons of this study includes, I'm going to highlight the cons: simplified homophobia, arousal interpretation, and lack of replication. I have not seen this study be replicated, and I also feel like there's other ways of testing if the id, ego, and superego come into play, but it was nonetheless a pretty interesting study. This study and article could have value to me or anyone else in the class because it exemplifies all the things that goes on inside of our brains to keep us safe. All of the safety precautions we have are not only physical but mental as well. It is important for the world of psychology to understand why people make certain decisions as well as why we make certain decisions. So in the real world, the word that kept coming to me was hypocrite. You know how when someone is calling you out for something and that they do all the time, it's pretty much projection. And this is why I said projection is my favorite, because it's the easiest to spot when you know what you're looking for. It happens every day on social media, in real life. Like, it literally happens every day. I challenge you guys to find 3 examples of projection next week. Lastly, relating my study to some modern outside information. So advertising often targets the id by promising immediate pleasure or social status. The ego helps us evaluate whether we actually need the product and whether we can afford the product, while the superego makes us consider the ethical implications of supporting certain brands or products. Another example of this would be social media. The id wants validation through likes and followers, while the ego helps us manage our online presence and build meaningful connections. Why am I saying collection? The superego makes us aware of the potential harm of cyberbullying and misinformation. And that is the end of my oral presentation of my study. Hope you guys are having a good week and keep pushing through. We only have 2 more weeks left, I think.